For 42 years, James Brown's daughter swallowed her terror in silence, carrying a memory she described as a bloody scene that will haunt me for the rest of my life. The world hailed James Brown as the Godfather of Soul, an immortal icon, a hero who once saved the city of Boston from chaos. But to Yama Brown, he was no savior. He was a demon disguised as a father, the one who planted fear and hatred that would never fade. And now, after 4 decades of silence, that horrifying truth has finally come to light. Do you have the courage to face the terrifying dark side of a legend? But that demon did not appear out of nowhere. It was planted in James Brown's own childhood, where violence, poverty, and abandonment branded his life like a curse. On May 3, 1933, the skies over Barnwell, South Carolina, baked under scorching heat. No breeze stirred, only thick red dust clinging to the dry cotton fields. In the suffocating air inside a fragile wooden shack at the edge of the woods, the fierce cries of James Joseph Brown, Jr. rang out. It was not the sound of new life, but a furious roar that seemed to announce a stormy destiny. Neighbors whispered, "A child born on such a suffocating day would rarely carry a blessed fate." Indeed, James Brown grew up in a world split apart by Jim Crow laws, where black people were pushed to the bottom of society. His father, Joe Brown, was a hard-rinking, harsh man who often took his anger out on his mother, Susie Bell. Night after night, the little boy curled up in a corner, listening to the sound of fists slamming, chairs breaking, and his mother's muffled sobs. In his young mind, James absorbed a twisted formula. Violence and love always went together. His father beat his mother, then hugged her, cried and begged, and the boy thought that was what love meant. At 6 years old, James witnessed the final fracture. His mother left without a word. That disappearance carved a cold emptiness into him, a fear of abandonment that never let go. Helpless and poor, his father sent him to live with an aunt in Augusta, Georgia. But that new house was no home. It was a brothel. James slept in a small room divided by a torn curtain, watching men come and go, listening to laughter mixed with liquor and smoke. His childhood shattered in shame and loneliness. Few knew that James once survived by digging out banana peels and scraps from trash cans. Once he tied wire around his torn shoes just to keep wearing them to school. White kids threw rocks at him on the street, and he wished only for a pair of boxing gloves to fight back. In that misery, a fierce desire ignited. Escape at any cost. At 13, James was arrested for stealing clothes from a car. Thrown into Toccoa Reformatory, he endured strict discipline, hunger, cold, and fights to survive. But that icy place awakened an unusual will. James whispered to a fellow inmate, "One day I'll be famous. I'll make the whole world remember the name James." His childhood was a chain of beatings, abandonment, and humiliation. But those dark memories became the mirror that shaped his life. The light of fame always walked hand in hand with the shadow of violence. The child born on that sweltering day in 1933 carried a fierce destiny. And when he stepped on stage, he was both legend and a vessel of unhealed torment. And that was only the beginning. From the hell of his childhood, James Brown would throw himself into music, searching for the light of the stage. But the ghosts of the past would never leave him. They would creep into his very first home. June 1953. James Brown was 20. Released on bail thanks to a gospel group, he decided to marry Velma Warren, a gentle, quiet woman. Their modest wedding in Georgia drew few guests. But for James, it marked a turning point. He believed he had found stability. 3 years later, Velma bore 3 sons, Teddy, Terry, and Larry. Yet from the start, the Brown family was no warm nest. Velma quickly saw that James knew nothing about being a husband or father, only about ruling. On April 4th, 1956, Please, Please, Please debuted. Within weeks, it climbed the R&B charts, turning James Brown into a sensation. On stage, he dropped to his knees, screamed until his voice cracked, drenched in sweat, as if collapsing, driving crowds wild. But even then, if a band member played a wrong note, James signaled to Doc $50 from their pay, right in front of the audience. A glance, a gesture, and the band understood. No one could make mistakes. That iron discipline earned fans awe, but for those on stage it meant living in fear. In 1962, during a tour in New Orleans, a young guitarist missed his cue by a few beats. James stopped singing, spun around, glared, and shouted into the microphone, "You're fired!" His roar thundered across the hall. The show went on. But backstage, the guitarist was thrown out on the spot, unpaid. Such scenes repeated until James became a tyrant king, even in music. At home, that tyranny cut even deeper. Velma was rarely seen in public. By the 1960s, the press began asking, why did the Godfather of Soul rarely appear with his wife and children? The truth was, James treated family as shadows meant to stand behind his glory. He controlled finances, forced his sons to practice music and dance for hours until exhausted. His son Larry recalled, he believed in absolute perfection and forced everyone to obey. To him, there was no family, only soldiers. October 1965, after a tour in Chicago, James came home drunk. Velma tried to talk about his constant absence, but the moment she spoke, he snapped, "You don't tell me how to live." He slammed a glass onto the table, shards scattering. Velma clutched the children and ran to their room, while James paced and muttered that no one could disrespect him. Such scenes haunted the Brown household, where every step James took spread fear. His obsession with control showed in small details. He always carried bundles of cash bound with rubber bands, neatly tucked in his pocket, a reminder of who held power. Before every show, James stared at himself in the mirror for hours. A single stray hair could trigger him to slap a stylist across the face. Appearance to James was not vanity, but a mask of power no one could touch. The most shocking part was how he treated those closest to him. In 1967, Velma dared to defy him, once asking to visit her mother. The result was a fiery fight witnessed by the whole family. James slammed doors, shouted, then vanished for weeks, leaving Velma and 3 children in fear. Around that time, the press began whispering about James Brown's control sickness, an illness no one yet knew would explode into public violence. April 1968. The nation reeled from the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., and Boston teetered on the edge of riots. On April 5th, James Brown stepped onto the Boston Garden stage in a glittering suit, urging the crowd to stay calm. He sang, he danced, he preached like a minister. And something strange happened. The crowd cooled, and riots never came. By morning, headlines proclaimed, "James Brown saves Boston." From that moment, he was no longer just a singer. He was the Godfather of Soul, the black hero of a generation. At the time, his fame soared. He spoke at a New York press conference, hailed as the black hero who saved Boston from violence. He stood tall, speaking of freedom, justice, and love for the community. But that very day, in his hotel room, he lashed out at Velma and their eldest son, Teddy, for spilling a glass of water. Light and darkness intertwined so closely, that even his own family no longer knew who was hero and who was demon. In March 1969, Velma Warren filed for divorce. 16 years of marriage ended in silence. No official accusations, no tabloid scandal, just a quiet exit from the life of a legend. Yet that silence thundered louder than any scream. Behind James Brown's glory, his family had long since collapsed. That was when James Brown transformed from young husband into music legend, but also from ordinary man into a power-obsessed figure. And once power took root, violence only waited for its chance to erupt. But that triumph planted in James Brown a dangerous belief. If he could save a city, he could rule a family. Worshipped as an icon, he began to believe he was untouchable. And the brighter his public light blazed, the heavier the darkness in his private life grew. In 1970, as James Brown crossed a great career milestone, he also entered the darkest chapter of his private life. He married Deidre D. Jenkins, a young, beautiful woman who seemed to promise peace after a chaotic decade. In 1971, she bore Diana. In 1972, Yama was born. But that same year when Yama arrived, James Brown shocked the nation by publicly endorsing President Richard Nixon. A political blow that shook the black community. Just a few years earlier, he had been hailed as Boston's savior. Suddenly, that image crumbled. Civil rights leaders turned their backs, calling him a traitor. Concerts once sold out now faced boycotts. The press blasted him, making James Brown a symbol of betrayal to the very movement he once uplifted. The furious crowds never knew that this backlash outside became fuel inside his home. James Brown could not bear rejection. Once hailed as the black hero, he now stood accused of siding with oppressors. That rage, mixed with drugs and a mind twisted by pride and isolation, needed release, and it fell on his young wife, Deidre D. Jenkins. From then on, violence in the household became ritual. Any night could be doomsday. The sequence repeated like a ghastly song. First, his thunderous roar shaking the house, DD like a sentence passed down. Then the heavy footsteps, the crash of objects shattering glass frames falling, and finally D slammed against the wall, crumpled on the floor, pinned under James's weight in a frenzy. When sober, James could be tender, hugging his daughters, promising to change. But when high, his eyes went vacant. His mouth raved nonsense. His body shook like a madman. In those moments, little Yama learned a terrifying truth. The legend, adored by the world, could turn into a monster in their kitchen. Then one sweltering summer night in 1975, the horror peaked. The house steamed with heat. D, barefoot in a blue and white robe, prepared dinner. Suddenly, James, high and wild-eyed, stormed in screaming, charging at her. He shoved her down, pinned her, and rained blows. The dull thuds echoed like hammers striking. Blood sprayed from Day's mouth and nose, staining the white tiles red. Yama, only 5, froze. She heard nothing but her own pounding heartbeat. Then instinct took over. She rushed forward, screaming, "Stop hitting Mama!" and leapt onto her father's back, pulling with all her tiny strength. For a moment, that small house in Georgia resounded with the cry of a child defying the demon wearing her father's face. But James was gone to madness. He flung her aside. Yama crashed to the floor, trembling. In that instant, she thought her mother would die before her eyes, and that she herself would be next. Years later, she admitted in her memoir, "He used Mama like a punching bag." That scene haunts me forever. And the nightmare did not stop there. Such moments repeated etched into their childhoods. Many nights, Deanna and Yama crawled under the bed, pressing pillows to their ears to block the sounds of smashing, the screams of DD and the sobs. In rare quiet, their father hugged them, whispered apologies. That was the real torment. Living between two worlds. One James Brown glowing on stage, and another James Brown dark as a ghost at home. By the late 1970s, as James Brown's career shook from politics and drugs, violence at home escalated. Dee was worn down. In January 1981, she finally filed for divorce. The news barely made headlines, the public unsuspecting. James Brown still held his head high, still the star. But for Deanna and Yama, the verdict had been carved into memory years earlier. It wasn't until more than 4 decades later, in 2014, that Yama Brown finally dared to reveal everything in her memoir, Cold Sweat, My Father James Brown and Me. She recounted the horrifying summer night of '75, when at just 5 years old, she leapt onto her father's back to save her mother from a bloody beating. American readers were stunned. The public that once hailed James Brown as Boston's hero now erupted in shock and grief. The man who saved a city was the same man who planted nightmares in his daughter's life. And nearly half a century later, in the docu-series Say It Loud 2024, Yama revisited that memory once again, this time with a trembling voice and eyes still filled with terror, making the contrast between legend and darkness impossible to deny. But the story did not end there. The scar followed Yama for life. She admitted to living in constant anxiety. Just the sound of a man's footsteps at night would make her shake and break out in cold sweat. For years, Yama sought therapy and relied on sedatives just to sleep. And the most bitter tragedy of all, when she grew up, she fell into an abusive marriage herself, as if the past had bound her into repeating her mother's cycle. I became my mother's mirror, she wrote. Even when I tried to escape, I kept hearing DD in my head every time my husband lost his temper. In her memoir and on film, Yama did not just accuse her legendary father. She exposed the generational scars of violence. James Brown once stopped a city from spilling blood. Yet he spilled the blood of his own household. And by the time Yama spoke, the world realized with horror, while James Brown shouted, "I'm black and I'm proud," to inspire millions. His own daughter spent her childhood cowering in fear. That was the cruelest truth. The hero of a city was the nightmare of his family. However, the violent side of James Brown, no matter how hard he tried to conceal it, could never truly be hidden, especially when he chose to plunge back into marriage after everything that had happened with Dedra D. Jenkins. In 1981, James Brown had just walked away from his divorce, with Dedra Jenkins seemingly closing a tragic family chapter. But 3 years later, he entered a new marriage. And this time, the darkness didn't stay behind closed doors. It exploded in public. In 1984, James married Adrienne Rodriguez, a young Puerto Rican singer, beautiful and fiery, the opposite of the patient endurance of his previous wives. Adrienne refused to submit. She pushed back, she argued, and that resistance made the conflict impossible to hide. By the mid-1980s, James Brown was back in the peace spotlight. In 1985, his song Living in America was chosen for the film Rocky IV, and his fiery Grammy performance in 1986 drew worldwide cheers. He was hailed as the flame that never goes out, a living symbol of American pride. But behind the lights, his marriage with Adrienne was collapsing. Police were repeatedly called to their South Carolina estate for domestic disputes. In 1987, one police report noted Adrienne fleeing the house with a bruised face, screaming, "He's going to kill me!" Neighbors were horrified, but few dared intervene. The press began labeling him a musical genius with a chaotic private life, a man both legend and disaster. The breaking point came on September 24, 1988, when a morning turned into a nightmare. High on drugs and mentally unstable James Brown stormed into an office building unrelated to him, waving a gun and demanding to know who used his bathroom. Police were called. James jumped into his pickup truck and fled. What followed was a 20-mile two-state car chase across Georgia and South Carolina. Police fired 17 shots into his tires before stopping him. When arrested, James Brown looked dazed, hair wild, unrecognizable as the Godfather of Soul who once saved Boston. Then, on December 6, 1988, the verdict came. 6 years in prison for weapons, drugs, assault, and resisting arrest. James Brown was handcuffed and taken to State Park Correctional Institution. American media exploded. Godfather of Soul jailed. The world was stunned. Some sympathized, blaming drugs and fame. Others saw it as the inevitable result of a life consumed by violence and chaos. Through 2.5 years behind bars, James Brown kept his swagger. He gave interviews claiming he was set up, insisting he would return. And in 1991, released early, he did return to the stage. Crowds still cheered, but his private life never recovered. Adrian filed for divorce, withdrew it, then filed again, then returned. The cycle of love and hate continued. Only this time, the whole world was watching. By 1993, headlines again reported police interventions after Adrian accused him of abuse. Each report sliced deeper into his image. The phrase musical genius with a chaotic private life clung to him through the 1990s. He could drive a crowd wild on stage, then be escorted to a police station for abuse allegations. But through it all, the one who collapsed was not James. It was his wife. On January 6, 1996, Adriana Rodriguez died suddenly during cosmetic surgery in Los Angeles at 47. Her death was swift and shocking, turning the once proud woman who had entered James Brown's life into a silent tragedy. News spread across America, echoing as loudly as the time she appeared bruised in public. Adrian was mourned as a woman both beautiful and broken, who lived her life in the shadow and fists of a music legend. Rumors spread that before surgery, Adrian confided to friends she wanted to renew herself to escape the past. But her life ended on the operating table, leaving unanswered questions. Did she leave peacefully or still haunted by James Brown? Her death closed one stormy marriage, but also left James Brown even more isolated, like a survivor in a war where everyone around him had fallen. What made it worse at the funeral, James Brown appeared in his familiar proud stance, flashing his half-smile in a glittering suit. He shed no public tears. The image enraged the public, a man who could love music passionately, but never love a woman properly. Adrian's life ended in cold death, while James Brown's tragedy only deepened, carving another crack into his legacy. The public saw it clearly. From 1984 to 1996, James Brown was no longer the hidden family tyrant. He was the center of public scandal. In the 1970s, only Yama and Diana saw the monster behind their father's face. By the 1980s, the whole world saw it on the front page. And when Adrian died, the press could only write, "A musical genius, a chaotic life." James Brown never escaped himself. From Deidre to Adrian, the tragedy grew. From the private fear of children to public scandals to the death of a wife. And for James Brown, the brighter the spotlight, the deeper the darkness. After all those stormy marriages, could the legend finally live his last years in peace? The answer was no. especially for a man like James Brown. In the early 2000s, when many thought James Brown had passed his prime and could enjoy quiet old age, he stunned the world again. At 68, the Godfather of Soul announced his marriage to Tommy Ray Heine, a singer and dancer 30 years younger. They married in 2001, and soon after she bore him a son, James Joseph Brown II. To the public, this looked like a promise of peace, a legend with a young wife to care for him, a youngest child as his anchor, but in reality it was just a thin coat of paint over a crumbling wall. From the start, darkness lingered. Police were repeatedly called to the Brown estate. Reports noted bruises on Tommy Ray's face, her panicked screams, and James Brown raging defiantly, even while in handcuffs. If in the 1970s, violence hid behind closed doors, by the 21st century, it played out in public, flashing under cameras. But that was only the surface. The real shock came when lawyers uncovered the marriage papers. Tommy Ray Heine had never finalized her annulment from a Bangladeshi husband. In other words, her 2001 marriage to James Brown may not have been legal at all. The revelation exploded like a bomb fueling conspiracy theories. For years, the public had seen Tommy Ray as a victim, a young woman trapped in James Brown's abuse. But once the legal details emerged, whispers turned. Maybe she wasn't only a victim. Maybe she had plotted entering the marriage while holding another marriage certificate as a backup. Some suspected she left it unresolved on purpose as a safety net, especially since she had given James a son. Suddenly, the abused wife image shifted into something far more complicated. Victim and strategist at once. Insiders in Brown's camp even suggested they knew about the marriage issue earlier, but kept silent, waiting until his death to unleash it during inheritance battles. And so James Brown's tragedy gained another twisted layer. A man who once fined $50 for a wrong note now lost control over his final marriage. Tommy Ray appeared the suffering wife, but in truth, she too had her own moves in the inheritance chess game. Still, James Brown pressed on. He kept performing head held high, declaring himself immortal. At home, the cycle repeated. Tommy Ray once told the press plainly, "He's a genius, but he's a storm. Living with James any day could be the end of the world." Then came winter 2006. On Christmas Eve, while families gathered around lights and trees, James Brown collapsed in an Atlanta hospital. On December 25th, the world learned the Godfather of Soul was dead at 73. He was remembered as a symbol of freedom, the soul of funk, an irreplaceable monument of music. But even as his last breath faded, the cracks widened. Just days after the funeral, instead of peace, his family plunged into chaos. Tommy Ray Heine claimed she was his legal wife, demanding rights for herself and her son. His children from previous marriages pushed back, declaring her a fake wife with no standing. Old marriage papers resurfaced, lawyers battled on TV, and the South Carolina courts became James Brown's next stage. Only this time he wasn't there. The public had long been used to seeing James Brown in handcuffs during the 1980s. Now, even after death, his family appeared in chains of legal feuds. His children accused Tommy Ray of exploiting his name and wealth. Tommy Ray wept on camera, insisting her son deserved his inheritance. Brown's estate, tens of millions of dollars, and priceless music rights became a battlefield. Worse, James Brown's will had specified that most of his wealth be given to a scholarship fund for poor children, his final humanitarian dream. But the will was frozen in court. Every dollar, every song, every piece of land was dragged into lawsuits. One judge remarked bitterly, "Even in death, James Brown makes the world keep arguing over him." Thus, the final chapter of The Godfather of Soul, did not close with echoing music, but with stacks of files, bitter disputes, and endless trials. Even in death, he pulled his family into an unending tragedy, leaving his last imprint as a musical genius with a ruined private life. A man whose stage shone bright, while his grave sank into quarrels. And even after his death on Christmas Day 2006, Yama Brown said through tears, "I know the world mourns him as a legend, but I don't. I only mourn the childhood stolen from me, the nights I thought my mother would die before my eyes. I never forgave him, not even when he lay in his grave." Looking back from Dedra to Adrian, then to Tommy Ray. From blood spattering in the kitchen, to car chases with gunfire, to inheritance wars in court, James Brown's life was like a song that never stopped. Only each verse hammered in another layer of tragedy, turning the legend into a restless ghost. So the question remains, who was the real James Brown? To you, a hero or a monstrous father? Leave your comment below and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss more haunting stories like